Hello everyone, we are again in the voltage control studio of the Institute of Sonology at the Royal Conservatoire in The Hague, also known as BEA 5. And today we are going to make another instruction video, and this is a special edition of the series of instruction videos because it is probably going to be the last one in this studio before Sonology moves to the new building of the conservatoire called Amare in the center of The Hague, and we will be operational again there hopefully in September. And of course our instruction video series will continue there, but in a slightly different setting, but with the same equipment, so don't worry, everything will be there. Today I'm going to show you some possibilities of random control voltages. The first question that we could ask is, why do you want to use randomness in music? And to give you a philosophical answer that was once put in a text by Gottfried Michael Koenig, you can use randomness when a rule merely suggests necessity. Well, you can think about that for a while. I know that in modular synthesizers like ARP and MOOCs and Serge and so on, and also in the current Eurorec hype, it's quite common practice to plug white noise into a sample and hold, for instance, and just see it as a supplier of random control signals. I, however, like to use a random source that gives me slightly more control over the randomness, for instance the speed of deviation, these kind of things. So the first thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you an old white noise generator from Hewlett & Packard called the precision noise generator. It was already in use in Utrecht when Sonology was still there. And it has some very special features, but first let's have a look at this device. So this is the Hewlett & Packard precision noise generator. And it is now on the setting white noise. And well, you probably all know how white noise sounds, but nevertheless I'm going to connect it and let you hear it. And I'm also going to connect it to the oscilloscope so that you can see it. And you can see that it is a very wild pattern of which the amplitude has random characteristics. Now this Hewlett & Packard precision noise generator has been modified by Sonology. It works on the basis of a table with random amplitude values which are cycled at a very high speed, at a clock of 5 megahertz. What I can do with this modified device is that I can turn off the internal clock, and you see that the signal now disappears, and I'm going to replace that internal clock with a pulse from a Sonology function generator. And I'm going to start at 10 kilohertz, so the highest frequency that is possible with this function generator. Now what you hear now is a kind of filtered noise. It still sounds like a continuous signal, but the highest frequencies that you heard in the white noise are now gone. And you can also see on the oscilloscope now that the signal is actually based on a step pattern. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to decrease the clock frequency for the noise signal further. And what I now hear is the frequency of the clock with a random amplitude variation. Now this signal with random amplitude characteristics is a perfect source for demodulation with an amplitude demodulator, also known as an envelope follower. So I'm going to disconnect the noise source from the mixing desk, and I connect it now to the input of an amplitude demodulator. From there I take the voltage out from the demodulator and I connect it to the tune input of another function generator, and that function generator now goes again to the mixing desk. What I hear now is a sine wave with a random frequency. And I have much better control now over the randomness than I would have had when I would have just plugged the white noise into it. Our amplitude demodulators have a switch, and the switch sets the speed with which the input signal is demodulated. It's now on 40, which is the average. I can go to 10. And as you can hear, the signal is now much smoother. So the speed of the incoming variation is now slowed down because the envelope follower is less capable of following the speed of the variation of the incoming signal. And I can also go to 160. And now I start to hear more details from the stepwise random pattern that is sent to the input. The patch that I just used looks as follows. There's a function generator giving me a pulse. This goes to the Hewlett-Packard noise generator. From there I go to an amplitude demodulator. That's an audio signal, so I use black. From there I have a voltage, and that voltage in this case goes to another function generator which gives me a sine wave, and that went to the mixing desk. If I want to have more control over the range of this control voltage, the easiest thing would be to do is to put in between a mixing amplifier, and then that mixing amplifier can control both the amplitude of the random signal, and by using a shift I can also scale it. But let's say that I want to have external signals controlling the upper and lower limits of the random signal. That becomes slightly more complicated. I can do it, for instance, like this. So I take the random signal, so that's this one here, and I send it to a DC multiplier. DC multiplier has been used in a previous demonstration. For now I'm just using a variable voltage source, which is a knob that gives me a voltage range in the range of the studio, between 0 and 5 volts. The multiplier has an X and a Y input, and the result is X multiplied by Y divided by 5. So that basically means if both X and Y are 5 volts, the multiplication is 25 divided by 5 is 5. So we have the full output at the DC multiplier. If one of them is 0, the output is 0, and if, for instance, X is 1 and Y is 5, then the output would be 1. So the variable voltage source in this case is controlling the amplitude of the random control voltage. If the variable voltage source is 0, there is no random signal, and if I turn it up to 5 volts, I have the original signal at the output of the DC multiplier. But now I also want to have control over the lower limit, and I want to be able to scale it. And I can do that like this. So I can send the signal to another DC multiplier, take a second variable voltage source, but this one I'm going to invert, and you will see why in a minute. Because I'm going to invert it, but I'm going to add the original, so the uninverted. I'm going to mix that with the output of the second DC multiplier. So this starts to look a little bit more complicated, but it is actually not complicated at all. Imagine that this one is at 0. Yeah? That means that the inversion is 5 volts. So here I have control over the amplitude of the random signal, and it is multiplied with the inversion of this one. If this is 0, this is 5 volts, so I have the full random signal here. When I'm going now to increase the second variable voltage source, I'm going to shift the voltage up because this continuous voltage is added to the output, but the inversion makes sure that also the amplitude of the random control voltage is reduced again. So I'm basically having now VVS 1 and 2. 1 is the lower limit, which I can bring up, and I have the upper limit, which can go up and down. So this is controlled by VVS 2 and this is controlled by VVS 1, and the random signal can move here. Let's see if that works. I made the patch and I'm now just going to show what the connections are. Here we have the trigger for the noise generator, the unit of packet noise generator. The output goes to an amplitude demodulator. The amplitude demodulator goes into a multiplier. Here I have a variable voltage source which goes to the second input of the multiplier. The output of this multiplier goes to the second multiplier. The second variable voltage source goes to an inverter, and then from the inverter to the second input of the multiplier. Then the multiplier output goes to the mixing amplifier, and the variable voltage source before the inversion goes to the second input of the mixing amplifier, and the mixing amplifier output goes to the function generator that gives the audio signal, and the output of the function generator goes to the mixing desk. If everything works as it should, variable voltage source 1 controls the upper limit of the random signal. So if I open it, I can hear if I now start to bring the lower limit up, okay, so the demonstration was successful. This is, of course, a way to demonstrate a principle. What I have basically done is I have created a window within which the random signal can fluctuate. I could have immediately jumped to a device in the studio that does all this for me, but I think from an educational point of view it's always important to demonstrate the principle behind the device as well. So this is why I did that. So now we are going to move to a device that was built to make this kind of control over random signals more convenient, and this device is called a tendency mask generator. Before I'm going to demonstrate the tendency mask generator, I need to explain what a tendency mask actually is. The idea of tendency masking comes from computer music programs such as Gottfried Wilhelm Koenig's Project 2 from the 60s, and the same ideas were developed simultaneously by composers such as Yannis Xenakis. What a tendency mask does is it not only controls the upper and lower limits of a random generator, but it also varies these upper and lower limits over time. So you have a mask shape that defines the tendency of a random signal. Here I have the upper and the lower limits as static values, but I can imagine that I would have a shape that looks like this, for instance. Where this is time, and the random signal should now move within these boundaries. And now the random signal has a tendency, it has a direction. That is possible to make. It would be possible to make it with this patch, but then I would only have one such signal, whereas the tendency mask generator allows me to have a mask shape, and within that mask shape I can have several random signals that are independent from one another, but that still are within these same boundaries, which I find from a musical point of view very attractive. If I want to use control voltages to control the upper and lower limits of a random signal, I need to take care of something. If I, for instance, take two ramps, so a ramp is a slow triangle wave or sawtooth wave with rising and decaying voltage. And I can use those for the upper and the lower limits of the random signal. But there's one thing I need to do, which is I have to make sure that the lower limit is never higher than the higher limit. You can imagine that if the random signal has to fluctuate between two values, the lowest value cannot be higher than the higher one. And that's an easy thing to solve by sending these two signals to a device in the studio which is called a voltage level comparator. The voltage level comparator has an A and a B input and a low and a high output. Let's say that these two triangle waves have two different frequencies, otherwise it would not make so much sense to use them at all. Then here, let's say that this is the one that would be controlling the highest limit of the random signal. Everything is fine, there is space for this random signal to fluctuate. But here, after this point, things tend to go wrong, because the higher limit now drops below the lower limit. After the level comparison, however, the low output will still be this one, and the high output will still be this one. And that means that if I control the random fluctuation with these two values, I always have space for the random signal to fluctuate. They can be very close, but there is always some space. So I'm going to send those to my tendency mask generator, and with this control voltage I can do anything I want. I can control the frequency of an oscillator, I can control the amplitude of an amplitude modulator, I can control the cutoff frequency of a filter, whatever I like. Tendency mask generator is here. It's called a V tendency mask generator, so it means it is voltage controlled. And I'm going to use the second one now. It's on internal control, so with these two knobs I have control over the upper and the lower limit of the random signal. Let's open the upper limit first. There is my signal. And now I'm bringing the lower limit up. But you can also hear now that when I bring the upper limit down, now I just have a steady signal because there is no space for the random signal to fluctuate. The yellow knob here controls the speed of the fluctuation. All those functions can be controlled externally with control voltages. I have two ramp generators here. Well, I have four, but I'm using only two. One is set at 7 seconds and the other at 11. So that means that the triangle wave takes 7 seconds to reach its peak and then another 7 seconds to go down. And the second one takes 11 seconds to go to the peak and then 11 seconds down. I could have chosen other values, but I like these prime numbers, because in that way it takes a very long time before the mask shape will repeat itself. Here are the two ramp outputs. The ramp outputs go to the level comparator. The low output from the level comparator goes to the lower limit of the tendency mask, and the high output of the level comparator goes to the upper limit of the tendency mask. On the oscilloscope we see now the lower and the upper limits, so the outputs of the level comparator, and as you can tell they sometimes get very close, but when they tend to cross each other they bounce, and this is exactly the moment where the upper limit becomes the lower limit and vice versa. So the range between the two green lines is the range for the random signal to fluctuate. So let's see if what we hear matches what we see. Instead of using the random control voltage to continuously control the frequency of the function generator, I can also send this random control voltage that comes from the tendency mask generator to a sample and hold first. The sample and hold is now connected. If you don't know how a sample and hold works, look at one of the earlier instruction videos. I think it's the one with the basic voltage control examples. The sample and hold for now is triggered by a function generator, so a regular pulse, and the result is this. But now that we are dealing with random signals, it is of course much nicer to also have a random pulse. The random pulse can be made by letting the random control voltage that comes from an amplitude demodulator touch the threshold of a DC trigger, but I also have a random pulse generator, so I'm immediately going to make use of that. The random pulse generator is a very small device. It's here. It has two switches. One that sets the low or high density of the pulses, and the other one that switches between pulse or noise. But it has 8 outputs and 1 input, and that's very convenient. The input is a control voltage that controls the density of the pulses, and the 8 outputs have similar densities, but they are independently random, which is also a very nice feature. So first I'm going to connect the control voltage to have control over the linear density of the pulses. And now I'm going to replace the pulse from the function generator with a pulse from the random pulse generator. Density is very low now. I can increase that, of course. Now that I have introduced the sample and hold and the random pulse generator, I can expand the patch a little bit further by taking the output of the oscillator that we are listening to not directly to the mixing desk, but first to an amplitude modulator, which is then controlled by an envelope generator, and the envelope generator receives the same pulse as the sample and hold. So here we see the pulse that goes to the sample and hold also connected to the envelope generator. The output of the envelope generator goes to the voltage input of an amplitude modulator. The oscillator's audio signal goes into the amplitude modulator, and the output of the modulator goes to the mixing desk. And now we have this. Little bit of reverb. I mentioned already that the tendency mass generator has the possibility to generate multiple random signals that fall within the same upper and lower limits. And I have done that now by making a patch here where the signals that are controlling the upper and lower limits are also going to the inputs of the second tendency mass generator. And I also mentioned that the random pulse generator has 8 outputs with random pulses that have the same linear density. So I have basically doubled the patch now, apart from the signals that are controlling the masks themselves, so the 2 ramps with the level comparator. That's still there. But now there are 2 sample and holds, there are 2 function generators for the audible signals, and I'm using 2 random pulse outputs, and I'm using 2 tendency mask outputs. So I have now 2 signals, one on the left and one on the right. And the mask now gets a second meaning, which is that when the mask range is very narrow, the 2 frequencies are becoming almost identical. When the mask range is wide, the 2 frequencies have the possibility to be very different. And I can even expand that to 4, but that would take too far for this demonstration. Before we end this session, we're going to have a look at the drawing of the patch. On the top there are the 2 ramps. One takes 7 seconds to go to the peak and 7 seconds to go down, and the other one 11 up and 11 down. They are going to the level comparator, so that I have one signal that is always the lowest of the 2 and the other one which is always the highest of the 2. These control the lower and upper limits of 2 random signals. The outputs of the 2 tendency mass generators go to the sample and holds. The sample and holds are triggered by two random pulses which have the same linear density, and the linear density is controlled by the voltage that comes from the variable voltage source. The outputs of the sample and holds go to two function generators. These are on the settings sine wave, exponential response to the control voltage, and between 0 and 10 kHz. The audio output of the function generators go to two amplitude modulators. The amplitude modulators are controlled by two envelope generators, and these envelope generators are triggered by the same pulses that go to the two sample and holds. That was it for today. See you in the new building.